O.G. Rose, and today we're going to be talking about a new core, considering cores versus systems, and this is section 55A of the address, the problem of scale, part 1, and basically what we're going to be talking about is a way to think about philosophers or thinking, and traditionally there's been kind of the idea that there are systems builders. There are these philosophers who make these great cathedrals of thought. Maybe you could think of an Aquinas with the Summa Theologica. Maybe you'll think of even someone like kind of Heidegger that's really building upon the concepts of being, or there's kind of this central concept that they're really orbiting that's very explicit and that comes out in their work. And what I want to argue now, in thoughts, there's a argument to be made that I'm not sure if as many of the great philosophers are quote-unquote systems builders as we tend to think. I think that can be a bit of an exaggeration. However, I also don't deny that there is plenty of systems building in philosophy. But the main idea is, just kind of focusing here on Ivan Illich and Nietzsche, that I think there's a kind of philosopher who can be almost thought of as a core thinker. And what a core thinker is someone of whom has a core idea that kind of erupts out in their work like lava from the core of the planet. You know, lava is all part of the same kind of center of the earth, if you will. I'm not saying that all lava or magma or whatever comes from the same location, but it's all kind of from a center. But the lava that pops out in Hawaii doesn't seem to be connected to the lava that pops out in Chile or somewhere else on the planet. It all seems kind of random and unconnected, but actually there's a core that connects all of the places where the lava spurts out. And likewise, I think we need to look at some philosophers that way. So, you know, a lot of people will look at someone like Nietzsche, and there's this feeling that Nietzsche's kind of random. You know, here he's talking about nationalism, here he's talking about the death of God, here he's talking about Zarathustra, here he's talking about a tightrope, and it all seems kind of all over the place. And for a lot of people, that's part of the charm of Nietzsche, that he's not a systematic philosopher, but that he's someone who's kind of responding passionately to what he observes and what he sees. But I would actually argue that there is a core to Nietzsche's thought, and I call it Bestow centrism. And he's critiquing where our identities, our values, and so on are primarily bestowed upon us by something external. Now, I don't think, you know, you never escape bestowing entirely, but there's a problem with when it's central. Centricism is thus the kind of the key word there. And so we see Nietzsche throughout book 5, The Gay Science. He's critiquing that, you know, if nationalism, patriotism, not just religion, but science, pragmatism even, you know, he's quite critical of us receiving our values, our identity from something external from us. And this is a core in his thinking, this critique of Bestow centricism that comes out throughout all of his works. It seems like his work is random and all over the place, but actually there's a core unifying it all, and you see a kind of the lava spurt out here and there in his different works. If he's critiquing the notion of values, well, he's critiquing the idea of Bestow centricism. When he's critiquing religion, he's critiquing Bestow centricism. When he's critiquing nationalism, pragmatism, so on and so forth. When he's talking about the tragic trade-offs between Apollo and Dionysus, that's something we have to live with if we're going to be human, but we might try to escape by turning to something to bestow our identity upon us. So there's a core to Nietzsche that is. Now the thing is about a lot of these core thinkers, and I actually will note that I think a lot of the modern Counter-Enlightenment thinkers were quote unquote core thinkers, and unfortunately that's one of the reasons why they get overlooked, because as much as we might say that we don't like systems builders, or so much as academia might say that it doesn't like, you know, philosophy built on these assumptions or axioms, we actually do tend to gravitate toward thinkers that are easy to paraphrase, or that have an explicit message or an explicit idea that they're always circling or going around. And we'll even misread philosophers if we can do it without realizing we're doing it, you know, in a form of plausible deniability into systems building, which I think has occurred with Hegel. And of course, this leads to a lot of problems, because this desire to kind of find the systematic construction of a philosopher, or to paraphrase them, I think can lead to us losing sight or missing the philosophy of notably someone like David Hume, where then he becomes a critique of rationality and inductive reasoning, as opposed to David Hume being someone who's making a distinction between good and bad philosophy, true and false philosophy, which is extremely important. So not having a space so basically the argument, by not having a space in our mind for a core thinker, for a core philosophy, we really do miss some really great thinking, and we really miss some of the kind of key arguments of some of these great philosophers like a David Hume, which I think is all about a return to common life and avoiding the barbaricism of refinement, which is a Foucault reference, or we can miss sort of the core of someone like Nietzsche, and then as a result, if you miss that core, you're more likely to fall into the mistakes Nietzsche was hoping to help us avoid, such as Bestow centricism. So I think it's very consequential if we don't have a category for core thinking. Now, a way to think about how core thinkers arise is it makes me think of Miss Flannery O'Connor, and Flannery O'Connor was really, in creative writing, very concerned about the tendency of quote-unquote symbols building, where, a student once asked her, why did the misfit have a hat on? What was the symbolism of the hat? And she was kind of like, to cover his head. And then, this created the impression that O'Connor didn't know what she was doing, right? But really, what she's trying to say, her whole idea is that if you tell a good story, if you are true to life, if you describe what you see, then it's going to be sacramental. It's going to more successfully point to deeper realities and divinity for her as a Catholic than if you try to create a symbol. Ironically, a symbol in the act of trying to be deeper ends up being more shallow. Whereas if you just, she believed God made the world, so if you accurately show and describe the world, you're going to point to God far more than if you create your own symbols. Symbols are a kind of impoverishment of sacrament if you're not careful. And it's kind of like, for her, it's the first things first principle from C.S. Lewis. You put first things first, you get second things also. You put second things first, you lose both. You got to put sacrament first, and then you can get symbols, but if you put symbols before sacraments, you lose both. But O'Connor's method, she really emphasizes seeing, staring, looking at clearly. It's very phenomenological. And if you really see a rock and really pay attention to it, then it can be a sacrament. Symbols tend to be what rush in when we don't look clearly, when we don't look close enough, when we don't, like a Cézanne, the painter, deeply observe the world, then we tend to create symbols. So symbols try to hide a lack of seeing. And I think we can associate this seeing with kind of the efforts of Heidegger to create clearings from which being can come forth, things of this nature. And I think a lot of what people talk about nihilism is a result of this lack of seeing. But the whole idea is that there's something very phenomenological about Flannery O'Connor and their notion of writing, which does make me also think about the great Butler, Butler and his creative, Robert Olson Butler. So, and for Flannery O'Connor, ultimately, the art of gazing and the art of living are really tied together, because if we can't see the world, we can't really get its sacrament, and if we can't understand its sacramental meaning, we can't participate in it rightly, sacramentally, and in a manner that the Christian should, pointing toward God. Now, another core thinker that I would like to highlight here, and we did a class at Parallax on him, is Ivan Illich, because I think Ivan Illich has a core to his thinking. That is a result, and here's the key, as Nietzsche stared closely and looked closely at many different fields, which helped him locate a core that came out of his work, not because he was trying to create a core, but just by looking clearly at reality, he ended up finding a core in the same way that Flannery O'Connor, if you look clearly at reality and describe it, you end up with a sacrament. Cores have to be, in this sense, secondary. Like if Nietzsche goes in saying, oh, I'm going to critique Bestow centricism, then that he might then be forcing upon the world his interpretation of it. And so the reliability of his finding might be a whole lot less. But if instead he just goes into each field or each topic and accurately tries to describe what he sees, then if a core arises, and arguably this might be the only method to arrive at a core, well, certainly for a genuine core, a real core, then there's all the more reason to believe it's real, because you keep seeing these themes, to allude to Alex and Andrew's work. This theme keeps appearing, and no matter where Nietzsche looks, you see this theme of the problems of Bestow-centricism come up. So all the more reason to think that Bestow-centricism is a problem, precisely because Nietzsche doesn't go in looking for it, but he sees it. Likewise, when a writer tries to create a symbol, there's not as much of a chance of that symbol actually being meaningful than just an accurate description of what's there for Flannery O'Connor. Likewise, the sin of some philosophers, whether we call it systems building or not, might be going into the world with a preset of idea of it, not letting the world arise and manifest to them instead, which would be much more Hegelian and kind of looking for a presupposition-less methodology, which would lead us into something that needs to be more propositional, that I've talked about in the Absolute Choice. But the idea is that core thinking, the methodologies of core thinking are much more phenomenological, and for that reason are arguably more reliable. Now, you can never get certainty in this life, but the very fact that you see this theme just continually popping up here and there provide all the more reason to think that it's actually there, that the results are reliable. And another thinker who is like Nietzsche is Ivan Illich. And what you see in Ivan Illich is someone who's looking at education. He's looking at the medical system. He's looking at prosperity, developmental plans. And what you see in Ivan Illich, to use a very large phrase, is what we talked about in the course, is that he's a core of a concern about the apocalypse of autonomous rationality or non-rationality. And what that means is Ivan Illich is a thinker of game theory and dynamics. He sees what happens when the medical industry is autonomously rational and it's operating according to a pure systems logic, or when wage labor operates according to a pure systems logic, where you end up with suboptimal results, just like in Nash equilibrium. So Ivan Illich, by going into all these fields and looking at them very clearly, ends up giving you a philosophy that shows you the limits of autonomous rationality, and by extension, game theory, because I believe game theory is often unfortunately interpreted as a means for us to become more rational on a systems level, when it should be understood as a revelation of the necessity of non-rationality to avoid Nash equilibria. Because I think there's a difference between rational, irrational, and non-rational. And game theory on the individual level is certainly a revelation of the need for non-rationality. But the problem is, the moment you think about it, you experience doing the non-rational as rational, so it seems like all you ever needed was the rational. There's this immediate loss of the non-rational as non-rational once you experience it and think about it, and thus translate it into rational terms. So it's hard to kind of get the role of non-rationality. It's something that you just glimpse, and a lot of O.G. Rose focuses on topics that you glimpse, or notions that you glimpse but never, you have to glimpse them, and then they're gone, and then they're back, and then they're gone, and so on and so forth. And you have to condition yourself to be the kind of being of whom can capture glimpses. And this also is something we talk about a lot when we talk about the phenomenology of the artist and reconstructing A as A. But anyway, Ivan Illich gives you a lot of examples in a lot of different fields of what happens when we let the system do our thinking for us, which also suggests the problems of Bestow centrism, and also how this leads to disablement. He talks a lot about disablement and how we're really, really disabled nowadays in all of these different fields, and how it's very hard to be human when we're disabled, and what do we need to do to regain humanity. It has a lot to do with awareness and regaining awareness, which sounds like Ian McGilchrist in his work. We have to choose our awareness, the ways that we're aware of reality, which is the ways we see reality, which transforms how we're in the world. So if we were to be aware of non-rationality, and we were to see non-rationality as having a role in everything we do, which also brings to mind the attention of Simone Weil, then that would transform how we operate in the world. And ultimately, it would lead to us needing to make an absolute choice, which will determine the difference between if history continues in a direction such as described by Nick Land, and that ends in artificial intelligence, disembodied intelligence, or if we would make a choice in favor of a human intelligence, an enfleshed intelligence. But that would require us to meet the man on the side of the road, as Ivan Illich talks about, and to face anxiety, which would get us into Lacan and psychoanalysis. All of this comes out in the Parallax course, which you can find at parallax.com. And for more by O.G. Rose, please visit ogrose.com, Twitter, Anchor, Instagram, so on and so forth. And thank you so much for your time.